Book 2, Chapter 2, Sections 5 through 8 of In the Days of the Comet. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. In the Days of the Comet by H.G. Wells, Book 2, Chapter 2, Sections 5 through 8. The figure of my mother comes always into my conception of the change. I remember how one day she confessed herself. She had been very sleepless that night, she said, and took the reports of the falling stars for shooting. There had been rioting in Clayton, and all through Swathinglea all day, and so she got out of bed to look. She had a dim sense that I was in all such troubles. But she was not looking when the change came. "When I saw the stars a-raining down, dear," she said, "and thought of you out in it, I thought there'd be no harm in saying a prayer for you, dear. I thought you wouldn't mind that." And so I got another of my pictures. The green vapors come and go, and there by her patched coverlet that dear old woman kneels and droops, still clasping her poor gnarled hands in the attitude of prayer to it, for me. Through the meagre curtains and blinds of the flawed refracting window I see the stars above the chimneys fade. The pale light of dawn creeps into the sky, and her candle flares and dies. That also went with me through the stillness, that silent kneeling figure, that frozen prayer to God to shield me, silent in a silent world, rushing through the emptiness of space. Section 6. With the dawn that awakening went about the earth. I have told how it came to me, and how I walked in wonder through the transfigured cornfields of Shaphambury. It came to every one near me, and for the time clear forgotten by me, Verrall and Nettie woke near one another. Each heard before all other sounds the other's voice amidst the stillness and the light, and the scattered people who had run to and fro and fallen on the beach of Bungalow Village awoke. The sleeping villagers of Menton started and sat up in that unwonted freshness and newness. The contorted figures in the garden, with the hymn still upon their lips, stirred amidst the flowers, and touched each other timidly, and thought of paradise. My mother found herself crouched against the bed, and rose with a glad, invincible conviction of accepted prayer. Already when it came to us, the soldiers, crowded between the lines of dusty poplars along the road to Allermont, were chatting and sharing coffee with the French riflemen who had hailed them from their carefully hidden pits among the vineyards up the slopes of Beauville. A certain perplexity had come to these marksmen, who had dropped asleep tensely ready for the rocket that should wake the whir and rattle of their magazines. At the sight and sound of the stir and human confusion in the roadway below, it had come to each man individually that he could not shoot. One conscript, at least, has told his story of his awakening, and how curious he thought the rifle there beside him in his pit, and how he took it on his knees to examine. Then, as his memory of its purpose grew clearer, he dropped the thing and stood up with a kind of joyful horror at the crime escaped, to look more closely at the men he was to have assassinated. Brave types, he thought, they looked for such a fate. The summoning rocket never flew. Below, the men did not fall into ranks again, but sat by the roadside or stood in groups, talking, discussing with a novel incredulity the ostensible causes of the war. "The Emperor," said they, and "Oh, nonsense, we're civilized men. Get someone else for this job. Where's the coffee?" The officers held their own horses and talked to the men frankly, regardless of discipline. Some Frenchmen out of the rifle pits came sauntering down the hill. Others stood doubtfully, rifles still in hand. Curious faces scanned these latter. Little arguments sprang as, "Shoot at us? Nonsense! They're respectable French citizens." There is a picture of it all, very bright and detailed, in the morning light, in the battle gallery amidst the ruins at Old Nancy, and one sees the old world uniform of the soldier, the odd caps and belts and boots, the ammunition belt, the water bottle, the sort of tourist's pack the men carried, a queer elaborate equipment. The soldiers had awakened one by one, first one and then another. I wonder sometimes whether, perhaps, if the two armies had come awake in an instant, the battle by mere habit and inertia might not have begun. But the men who waked first, sat up, looked about them in astonishment, had time to think a little. Section 7. Everywhere there was laughter, everywhere tears. Men and women in the common life, finding themselves suddenly lit and exalted, capable of doing what had hitherto been impossible, incapable of doing what had hitherto been irresistible, happy, hopeful, unselfishly energetic, rejected altogether the supposition that this was merely a change in the blood and material texture of life. They denied the bodies God had given them, as once the Upper Nile savages struck out their canine teeth, because these made them like the beasts. They declared that this was the coming of a spirit, and nothing else would satisfy their need for explanations. And in a sense the spirit came. The great revival sprang directly from the change. The last, the deepest, widest, and most enduring of all the vast inundations of religious emotion that go by that name. But indeed it differed essentially from its innumerable predecessors. The former revivals were a phase of fever. This was the first movement of health, and it was altogether quieter, more intellectual, more private, more religious than any of the others. In the old time, and more especially in the Protestant countries, where the things of religion were outspoken, and the absence of confession and well-trained priests made religious states of emotion explosive and contagious, revivalism upon various scales was a normal phase in the religious life. Revivals were always going on. Now a little disturbance of consciences in a village, now an evening of emotion in a mission room, and now a great storm that swept a continent, and now an organized effort that came to town with bands and banners and handbills and motor cars for the saving of souls. Never at any time did I take part in, nor was I attracted by, any of these movements. My nature, although passionate, was too critical, or skeptical if you like, for it amounts to the same thing, and shy to be drawn into these whirls. But on several occasions Parload and I sat, scoffing, but nevertheless disturbed, in the back seats of revivalist meetings. I saw enough of them to understand their nature, and I'm not surprised to learn now that before the Comet came, all about the world, even among savages, even among cannibals, these same, or at any rate closely similar, periodic upheavals went on. The world was stifling, it was in a fever, and these phenomena were neither more nor less than the instinctive struggle of the organism against the ebb of its powers, the clogging of its veins, the limitation of its life. Invariably these revivals followed periods of sordid and restricted living. Men obeyed their base, immediate motives until the world grew unendurably bitter. Some disappointment, some thwarting, lit up for them, darkly indeed, but yet enough for indistinct vision, the crowded squalor, the dark enclosure of life, a sudden disgust with the insensate smallness of the old world way of living, a realization of sin, a sense of the unworthiness of all individual things, a desire for something comprehensive, sustaining, something greater, for wider communions and less habitual things, filled them. Their souls, which were shaped for wider issues, cried out suddenly amidst the petty interests, the narrow prohibitions of life, "Not this, not this!" A great passion to escape from the jealous prison of themselves, an inarticulate, stammering, weeping passion shook them. I remember how once in Clayton Calvinistic Methodist Chapel I saw his spotty fat face, strangely distorted under the flickering gas flares, old Pallet, the ironmonger, repent. He went to the form of repentance, a bench reserved for such exhibitions, and slobbered out his sorrow and disgust for some sexual indelicacy. He was a widower, and I can see now how his loose fat body quivered and swayed with his grief. He poured it out to 500 people, from whom in common times he hid his every thought and purpose. And it is a fact, it shows where reality lay, that we two youngsters laughed not at all at that blubbering grotesque. We did not even think the distant shadow of a smile. We two sat grave and intent, perhaps wondering. Only afterward, and with an effort, did we scoff. Those old-time revivals were, I say, the convulsive movements of a body that suffocates. They are the clearest manifestations from before the change of a sense in all men that things were not right, but they were too often but momentary illuminations. Their force spent itself in incoordinated shouting, gesticulations, tears. They were but flashes of outlook. Disgust of the narrow life, of all baseness, took shape in narrowness and baseness. The quickened soul ended the night a hypocrite. Prophets disputed for precedence, seductions, it is altogether indisputable, were frequent among penitents. And Ananias went home converted, and returned with a falsified gift. And it was almost universal that the converted should be impatient and immoderate, scornful of reason and a choice of expedients, opposed to balance, skill, and knowledge, incontinently full of grace, like thin old wineskins overfilled. They felt they must burst if once they came into contact with hard fact and sane direction. So the former revivals spent themselves, but the great revival did not spend itself, but grew to be, for the majority of Christendom, at least the permanent expression of the change. For many it has taken the shape of an outright declaration that this was the second advent. It is not for me to discuss the validity of that suggestion. For nearly all it has amounted to an enduring broadening of all the issues of life. Section 8. One irrelevant memory comes back to me. Irrelevant, and yet by some subtle trick of quality it summarizes the change for me. It is the memory of a woman's very beautiful face, a woman with a flushed face and tear-bright eyes, who went by me without speaking, wrapped in some secret purpose. I passed her when in the afternoon of the first day, struck by a sudden remorse, I went down to Menton to send a telegram to my mother, telling her all was well with me. Whither this woman went I do not know, nor whence she came. I never saw her again, and only her face, glowing with that new and luminous resolve, stands out for me. But that expression was the world's. End of Book 2, Chapter 2, Sections 5 through 8. Book 2, Chapter 3, Section 1 of In the Days of the Comet. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. In the Days of the Comet by H.G. Wells. Book 2, Chapter 3, Section 1. The Cabinet Council. And what a strange, unprecedented thing was that cabinet council at which I was present. The council that was held 2 days later in Melmount's bungalow, and which convened the conference to frame the constitution of the world state. I was there because it was convenient for me to stay with Melmount. I had nowhere to go particularly, and there was no one at his bungalow, to which his broken ankle confined him, but a secretary and a valet, to help him to begin his share of the enormous labours that evidently lay before the rulers of the world. I wrote shorthand, and as there was not even a phonograph available, I went in so soon as his ankle had been dressed, and sat at his desk to write at his dictation. It is characteristic of the odd slackness that went with the spasmodic violence of the old epoch that the secretary could not use shorthand, and that there was no telephone whatever in the place. Every message had to be taken to the village post office in that grocer's shop at Menton, half a mile away. And so I sat in the back of Melmount's room. His desk had been thrust aside, and made such memoranda as were needed. At that time his room seemed to me the most beautifully furnished in the world, and I could identify now the vivid cheerfulness of the chintz of the sofa on which the great statesman lay just in front of me, the fine rich paper, the red sealing wax, the silver equipage of the desk I used. I know now that my presence in that room was a strange and remarkable thing. The open door, even the coming and going of Parker, the secretary, innovations. In the old days a cabinet council was a secret conclave. Secrecy and furtiveness were in the texture of all public life. In the old days everybody was always keeping something back from somebody, being wary and cunning, prevaricating, misleading, for the most part for no reason at all. Almost unnoticed, that secrecy had dropped out of life. I close my eyes and see those men again, hear their deliberating voices. First I see them a little diffusely in the cold explicitness of daylight, and then concentrated and drawn together amidst the shadow and mystery about shaded lamps. Integral to this, and very clear, is the memory of biscuit crumbs and a drop of spilt water that at first stood shining upon and then sank into the green tablecloth. I remember particularly the figure of Lord Adisham. He came to the bungalow a day before the others because he was Melmount's personal friend. Let me describe this statesman to you. This one of the 15 men who made the last war. He was the youngest member of the government, and an altogether pleasant and sunny man of 40. He had a clear profile to his clean grey face, a smiling eye, a friendly, careful voice upon his thin, clean-shaven lips, an easy, disabusing manner. He had the perfect quality of a man who had fallen easily into a place prepared for him. He had the temperament of what we used to call a philosopher, an indifferent, that is to say. The change had caught him at his week-end recreation, fly-fishing, and indeed, he said, I remember that he recovered to find himself with his head within a yard of the water's brim. In times of crises, Lord Adisham invariably went fly-fishing at the week-end to keep his mind in tone, and when there was no crisis, then there was nothing he liked so much to do as fly-fishing, and so, of course, as there was nothing to prevent it, he fished. He came resolved, among other things, to give up fly-fishing altogether. I was present when he came to Melmount, and heard him say as much, and by a more naive route it was evident that he had arrived at the same scheme of intention as my master. I left them to talk, but afterward I came back to take down their long telegrams to their coming colleagues. He was, no doubt, as profoundly affected as Melmount by the change, but his tricks of civility and irony and acceptable humour had survived the change, and he expressed his altered attitude, his expanded emotions, in a quaint, modification of the old-time man-of-the-world style, with excessive moderation, with a trained horror of the enthusiasm that swayed him. These 15 men who ruled the British Empire were curiously unlike anything I had expected, and I watched them intently whenever my services were not in request. They made a peculiar class at that time, these English politicians and statesmen, a class that has now completely passed away. In some respects they were unlike the statesmen of any other region of the world, and I do not find that any really adequate account remains of them. Perhaps you are a reader of the old books. If so, you will find them rendered with a note of hostile exaggeration by Dickens in Bleak House, with a mingling of gross flattery and keen ridicule by Disraeli, who ruled among them accidentally by misunderstanding them and pleasing the court, and all their assumptions are set forth portentously, perhaps, but truthfully, so far as people of the permanent official class saw them, in the novels of Mrs. Humphrey Ward. All these books are still in this world and at the disposal of the curious, and in addition, the philosopher Bagehot and the picturesque historian Macaulay give something of their method of thinking. The novelist Thackeray skirts the seamy side of their social life, and there are some good passages of irony, personal descriptions, and reminiscence to be found in the 20th century Garner, from the pens of such writers, for example, as Sidney Lowe. But a picture of them as a whole is wanting. Then they were too near and too great. Now very rapidly they have become incomprehensible. We common people of the old time based our conception of our statesmen almost entirely on the caricatures that form the most powerful weapon in political controversy. Like almost every main feature of the old condition of things, these caricatures were an unanticipated development. They were a sort of parasitic outgrowth from, which had finally altogether replaced, the thin and vague aspirations of the original democratic ideals. They presented not only the personalities who led our public life, but the most sacred structural conceptions of that life, in ludicrous, vulgar, and dishonorable aspects that in the end came near to destroying entirely all grave and honorable emotion or motive toward the state. The state of Britain was represented nearly always by a red-faced, purse-proud farmer with an enormous belly, that fine dream of freedom, the United States, by a cunning, lean-faced rascal in striped trousers and a blue coat. The chief ministers of state were pickpockets, washerwomen, clowns, whales, asses, elephants, and what not. And issues that affected the welfare of millions of men were dressed and judged like a rally in some idiotic pantomime. A tragic war in South Africa that wrecked many thousand homes, impoverished 2 whole lands, and brought death and disablement to 50,000 men, was presented as a quite comical quarrel between a violent, queer being named Chamberlain, with an eyeglass, an orchid, and a short temper, and an old Kruger, an obstinate and very cunning old man in a shocking bad hat. The conflict was carried through in a mood sometimes of brutish irritability and sometimes of lax slovenliness. The merry peculator plied his trade congenially in that asinine squabble, and behind these fooleries and masked by them marched fate, until at last the clowning of the booth opened and revealed hunger and suffering, brands burning and swords and shame. These men had come to fame and power in that atmosphere, and to me that day there was the oddest suggestion in them of actors who have suddenly laid aside grotesque and foolish parts. The paint was washed from their faces, the posing put aside. Even when the presentation was not frankly grotesque and degrading, it was entirely misleading. When I read of Laycock, for example, there arises a picture of a large, active, if a little wrong-headed intelligence in a compact, heroic body, emitting that Goliath speech of his that did so much to precipitate hostilities. It tallies not at all with the stammering, high-pitched, slightly bald, and very conscience-stricken personage I saw, nor with Melmount's contemptuous first description of him. I doubt if the world at large will ever get a proper vision of those men as they were before the change. Each year they pass more and more incredibly beyond our intellectual sympathy. Our estrangement cannot indeed rob them of their position in the past, but it will rob them of any effect of reality. The whole of their history becomes more and more foreign, more and more like some queer barbaric drama played in a forgotten tongue. There they strut through their weird metamorphoses of caricature, those premiers and presidents, their height preposterously exaggerated by political buskins, their faces covered by great resonant inhuman masks, their voices couched in the foolish idiom of public utterance, disguised beyond any semblance to sane humanity, roaring and squeaking through the public press. There it stands, this incomprehensible faded show, a thing left on one side and now still and deserted by any interest, its many emptinesses as inexplicable now as the cruelties of medieval Venice, the theology of old Byzantium. And they ruled and influenced the lives of nearly a quarter of mankind, these politicians. Their clownish conflicts swayed the world, made mirth perhaps, made excitement, and permitted infinite misery. I saw these men, quickened indeed by the change, but still wearing the queer clothing of the old time, the manners and conventions of the old time. If they had disengaged themselves from the outlook of the old time, they still had to refer back to it constantly as a common starting point. My refreshed intelligence was equal to that, so that I think I did indeed see them. There was Gorrell Browning, the Chancellor of the Duchy. I remember him as a big round-faced man, the essential vanity and foolishness of whose expression, whose habit of voluminous platitudinous speech, triumphed absurdly once or twice over the roused spirit within. He struggled with it, he burlesqued himself and laughed. Suddenly he said simply, intensely, it was a moment for every one of clean, clear pain. I have been a vain and self-indulgent and presumptuous old man. I am of little use here. I have given myself to politics and intrigues, and life is gone from me. And then for a long time he sat still. There was Carton, the Lord Chancellor, a white-faced man with understanding. He had a heavy, shaven face that might have stood among the busts of the Caesars, a slow, elaborating voice with self-indulgent, slightly oblique and triumphant lips, and a momentary, voluntary, humorous twinkle. "We have to forgive," he said. "We have to forgive even ourselves." These two were at the top corner of the table, so that I saw their faces well. Madgett, the Home Secretary, a smaller man with wrinkled eyebrows and a frozen smile on his thin, wry mouth, came next to Carton. He contributed little to the discussion save intelligent comments, and when the electric lights above glowed out, the shadows deepened queerly in his eye sockets and gave him the quizzical expression of an ironical goblin. Next him was that great peer, the Earl of Richover, whose self-indulgent indolence had accepted the role of a 20th century British Roman patrician of culture, who had divided his time almost equally between his jockeys, politics, and the composition of literary studies in the key of his role. "We have done nothing worth doing," he said. "As for me, I have cut a figure." He reflected, no doubt, on his ample patrician years, on the fine great houses that had been his setting, the teeming race courses that had roared his name, the enthusiastic meetings he had fed with fine hopes, the futile Olympian beginnings. "I have been a fool," he said compactly. They heard him in a sympathetic and respectful silence. Gurker, the Chancellor of the Exchequer, was partially occulted, so far as I was concerned, by the back of Lord Adisham. Ever and again Gurker protruded into the discussion, swaying forward, a deep throaty voice, a big nose, a coarse mouth with a drooping everted lower lip, eyes peering amidst folds and wrinkles. He made his confession for his race. "We Jews," he said, "have gone through the system of this world, creating nothing, consolidating many things, destroying much. Our racial self-conceit has been monstrous. We seem to have used our ample coarse intellectuality for no other purpose than to develop and master and maintain the convention of property, to turn life into a sort of mercantile chess and spend our winnings grossly. We have had no sense of service to mankind. Beauty, which is Godhead, we made it a possession." These men and these sayings particularly remain in my memory. Perhaps indeed I wrote them down at one time, but that I do not now remember. How Sir Digby Privet, Revel, Markheimer, and the others sat, I do not now recall. They came in as voices, interruptions, imperfectly assigned comments. One got a queer impression that, except perhaps for Gurker or Revel, these men had not particularly wanted the power they held, had desired to do nothing very much in the positions they had secured. They had found themselves in the cabinet, and until this moment of illumination they had not been ashamed. But they had made no ungentlemanly fuss about the matter. 8 of that 15 came from the same school, had gone through an entirely parallel education, some Greek linguistics, some elementary mathematics, some emasculated science, a little history, a little reading in the silent or timidly orthodox English literature of the 17th, 18th, and 19th centuries. All 8 had imbibed the same dull, gentlemanly tradition of behavior, essentially boyish, unimaginative, with neither keen swords nor art in it, a tradition apt to slobber into sentiment at a crisis and make a great virtue of a simple duty rather clumsily done. None of these 8 had made any real experiments with life. They had lived in blinkers. They had been passed from nurse to governess, from governess to preparatory school, from Eton to Oxford, from Oxford to the politico-social routine. Even their vices and lapses had been according to certain conceptions of good form. They had all gone to the races surreptitiously from Eton, had all cut up to town from Oxford to see life, music-hall life, had all come to heel again. Now suddenly they discovered their limitations. "What are we to do?" asked Melmount. "We have awakened. This empire in our hands. I know this will seem the most fabulous of all the things I have to tell of the old order, but indeed I saw it with my eyes, I heard it with my ears. It is a fact that this group of men who constituted the government of 1/5 of the habitable land of the earth, who ruled over 1 million of armed men, who had such navies as mankind had never seen before, whose empire of nations, tongues, peoples still dazzles in these greater days, had no common idea whatever of what they meant to do with the world. They had been a government for 3 long years, and before the change came to them it had never even occurred to them that it was necessary to have no common idea. There was no common idea at all. that great empire was no more than a thing adrift, an aimless thing that ate and drank and slept and bore arms and was inordinately proud of itself because it had chanced to happen. It had no plan, no intention. It meant nothing at all, and the other great empires, adrift, perilously adrift, like marine mines, were in the self-same case. Absurd as a British Cabinet Council must seem to you now, it was no whit more absurd than the controlling ganglion, autocratic council, President's Committee, or what not, of each of its blind rivals. End of Book 2, Chapter 3, Section 1. Book 2, Chapter 3, Sections 2 and 3 of In the Days of the Comet. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. In the Days of the Comet by H.G. Wells, Book 2, Chapter 3, Sections 2 and 3. I remember as one thing that struck me very forcibly at the time, the absence of any discussion, any difference of opinion about the broad principles of our present state. These men had lived hitherto in a system of conventions and acquired motives, loyalty to a party, loyalty to various secret agreements and understandings, loyalty to the Crown. They had all been capable of the keenest attention to precedents, all capable of the most complete suppression of subversive doubts and inquiries. All had their religious emotions under perfect control. They had seemed protected by invisible but impenetrable barriers from all the heady and destructive speculations, the socialistic, republican, and communistic theories that one may still trace through the literature of the last days of the comet. But now, as it was, as if the very moment of the awakening, those barriers and defences had vanished, as if the green vapours had washed through their minds and dissolved and swept away 100 once rigid boundaries and obstacles. They had admitted and assimilated at once all that was good in the ill-dressed propagandas that had clamoured so vehemently and vainly at the doors of their minds in the former days. It was exactly like the awakening from an absurd and limiting dream. They had come out together naturally and inevitably upon the broad daylight platform of obvious and reasonable agreement upon which we and all the order of our world now stand. Let me try to give the chief things that had vanished from their minds. There was, first, the ancient system of ownership that made such an extraordinary tangle of our administration of the land upon which we lived. In the old time no one believed in that as either just or ideally convenient, but every one accepted it. The community which lived upon the land was supposed to have waived its necessary connection with the land, except in certain limited instances of highway and common. All the rest of the land was cut up in the maddest way into patches and oblongs and triangles of various sizes, between 100 square miles and a few acres, and placed under the nearly absolute government of a series of administrators called landowners. They owned the land almost as a man now owns his hat. They bought it and sold it, and cut it up like cheese or ham. They were free to ruin it or leave it waste, or erect upon it horrible and devastating eyesores. If the community needed a road or a tramway, if it wanted a town or a village in any position, nay, even if it wanted to go to and fro, it had to do so by exorbitant treaties with each of the monarchs whose territory was involved. No man could find foothold on the face of the earth until he had paid toll and homage to one of them. They had practically no relations and no duties to the nominal, municipal, or national government, amidst whose larger areas their own dominions lay. This sounds, I know, like a lunatic's dream, but mankind was that lunatic, and not only in the old countries of Europe and Asia, where the system had arisen out of the rational delegation of local control to territorial magnates, who had, in the universal baseness of those times, at last altogether evaded and escaped their duties did it obtain, but the new countries, as we called them then, the United States of America, the Cape Colony, Australia, and New Zealand, spent much of the 19th century in the frantic giving away of land forever to any casual person who would take it. Was there coal, was there petroleum or gold, was there rich soil or harborage, or the site for a fine city? These obsessed and witless governments cried out for scramblers, and a stream of shabby, tricky, and violent adventurers set out to found a new section of the landed aristocracy of the world. After a brief century of hope and pride, the great Republic of the United States of America, the hope as it was deemed of mankind, became for the most part a drifting crowd of landless men, landlords and railway lords, food lords, for the land is food, and mineral lords ruled its life, gave it universities as one gave coins to a mendicant, and spent its resources upon such vain, tawdry, and foolish luxuries as the world had never seen before. Here was a thing none of these statesmen before the change would have regarded as anything but the natural order of the world, which not one of them now regarded as anything but the mad and vanished illusion of a period of dementia. And as it was with the question of the land, so was it also with 100 other systems and institutions and complicated and disingenuous factors in the life of man. They spoke of trade, and I realized for the first time there could be buying and selling. There was no loss to any man. They spoke of industrial organization, and one saw it under captains who sought no base advantages. The haze of old associations, of personal entanglements and habitual recognitions, had been dispelled from every stage and process of the social training of men. Things long hidden appeared discovered with an amazing clearness and nakedness. These men who had awakened laughed dissolvent laughs, and the old muddle of schools and colleges, books and traditions, the old fumbling, half-figurative, half-formal teachings of the churches, the complex of weakening and confusing suggestions and hints, amidst which the pride and honor of adolescence doubted and stumbled and fell, became nothing but a curious and pleasantly faded memory. There must be a common training of the young, said Rickover, a frank initiation. We have not so much educated them as hidden things from them and set traps. And it might have been so easy. It can all be done so easily. That hangs in my memory as the refrain of that council. It can all be done so easily. But when they said it then, it came to my ears with a quality of enormous refreshment and power. It can all be done so easily, given frankness, given courage. Time was when these platitudes had the freshener of wonder of a gospel. In this enlarged outlook, the war with the Germans, that mythical, heroic, armed female Germany, had vanished from men's imaginations, was a mere exhausted episode. A truce had already been arranged by Melmount, and these ministers, after some marvelling reminiscences, set aside the matter of peace as a mere question of particular arrangements. The whole scheme of the world government had become fluid and provisional in their minds, in small details as in great. The unanalyzable tangle of wards and vestries, districts and municipalities, counties, states, boards and nations, the interlacing, overlapping and conflicting authorities, the felt of little interests and claims in which an innumerable and insatiable multitude of lawyers, agents, managers, bosses, organizers lived like fleas in a dirty old coat. The web of the conflicts, jealousies, heated patchings up and jobbings apart of the old order, they flung it all on one side. "What are the new needs?" said Melmount. "This muddle is too rotten to handle. We're beginning again. Well, let us begin afresh." Section 3. Let us begin afresh. This piece of obvious common sense seemed then to me instinct with courage, the noblest of words. My heart went out to him as he spoke. It was indeed that day as vague as it was valiant. We did not at all see the forms of what we were thus beginning. All that we saw was the clear inevitableness that the old order should end. And then in a little space of time mankind in halting but effectual brotherhood was moving out to make its world anew. Those early years, those first and second decades of the new epoch, were in their daily detail a time of rejoicing toil. One saw chiefly one's own share in that, and little of the whole. It is only now that I look back at it from these ripe years, from this high tower, that I see the dramatic sequence of its changes, see the cruel old confusions of the ancient time become clarified, simplified, and dissolve and vanish away. Where is that old world now? Where is London, that sombre city of smoke and drifting darkness, full of the deep roar and haunting music of disorder, with its oily, shining, mud-rimmed, barge-crowded river, its black pinnacles and blackened dome, its sad wildernesses of smut-grayed houses, its myriads of draggled prostitutes, its millions of hurrying clerks? The very leaves upon its trees were foul with greasy black defilements. Where is lime-white Paris, with its green and disciplined foliage, its hard unflinching tastefulness, its smartly organized viciousness, and the myriads of workers, noisily shod, streaming over the bridges in the grey cold light of dawn? Where is New York, the high city of clangor and infuriated energy, wind-swept and competition-swept, its huge buildings jostling one another and straining ever upward for a place in the sky? The fallen piteously overshadowed. Where are its lurking corners of heavy and costly luxury, the shameful bludgeoning bribing vice of its ill-ruled underways, and all the gaunt extravagant ugliness of its strenuous life? And where now is Philadelphia, with its innumerable small and isolated homes, and Chicago, with its interminable blood-stained stockyards, its polyglot underworld of furious discontent? All these vast cities have given way and gone, even as my native potteries and the black country have gone, and the lives that were caught, crippled, starved, and maimed amidst their labyrinths, their forgotten and neglected maladjustments, and their vast, inhuman, ill-conceived industrial machinery, have escaped to life. Those cities of growth and accident are altogether gone. Never a chimney smokes about our world today, and the sound of the weeping of children who toiled and hungered, the dull despair of overburdened women, the noise of brute quarrels in alleys, all shameful pleasures and all the ugly grossness of wealthy pride have gone with them, with the utter change in our lives. As I look back into the past, I see a vast exultant dust of housebreaking and removal rise up into the clear air that followed the hour of the green vapors. I live again the year of tents, the year of scaffolding, and like the triumph of a new theme in a piece of music, the great cities of our new days arise. Come Caerleon and Armaghan, the twin cities of Lower England, with the winding summer city of the Thames between, and I see the gaunt dirt of old Edinburgh die to rise again, white and tall, beneath the shadow of her ancient hill. And Dublin too, reshaped, returning, enriched, fair, spacious, the city of rich laughter and warm hearts, gleaming daily in a shaft of sunlight through the soft, warm rain. I see the great cities America has planned and made, the golden city with ever-ripening fruit along its broad, warm ways, and the bell-glad city of 1,000 spires. I see again, as I have seen, the city of theaters and meeting places, the city of the sunlight bite, and the new city that is still called Utah, and dominated by its observatory dome and the plain and dignified lines of the university facade upon the cliff. Martenabar, the great white winter city of the upland snows, and the lesser places too, the townships, the quiet resting places, the villages, half forest with a brawl of streams down their streets, villages laced with avenues of cedar, villages of garden, of roses and wonderful flowers, and the perpetual humming of bees. And through all the world go our children. Our sons the old world would have made into servile clerks and shopmen, plough drudges and servants. Our daughters, who were erst anemic drudges, prostitutes, sluts, anxiety-racked mothers or seer, repining failures, they go about this world glad and brave, learning, living, doing, happy and rejoicing, brave and free. I think of them wandering in the clear quiet of the ruins of Rome, among the tombs of Egypt or the temples of Athens, of their coming to Mainington and its strange happiness, to Orba and the wonder of its white and slender tower. But who can tell of the fullness and pleasures of life? Who can number all our new cities in the world, cities made by the loving hands of men for living men, cities men weep to enter, so fair they are, so gracious and so kind? Some vision surely of these things must have been vouchsafed me as I sat there behind Melmount's couch, but now my knowledge of accomplished things has mingled with and effaced my expectations. Something indeed I must have foreseen, or else why was my heart so glad? End of Book 2, Chapter 3, Sections 2 and 3. Book 3, Chapter 1, Section 1 of In the Days of the Comet. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. In the Days of the Comet by H.G. Wells, Book 3, Chapter 1, Section 1. Love after the change. So far I have said nothing of Nettie. I have departed widely from my individual story. I have tried to give you the effect of the change in relation to the general framework of human life, its effect of swift, magnificent dawn, of an overpowering letting in and inundating of light and the spirit of living. In my memory, all my life before the change has the quality of a dark passage, with the dimmest side gleams of beauty that come and go. The rest is dull pain and darkness. Then suddenly the walls, the bitter confines are smitten and vanish, and I walk blinded, perplexed, and yet rejoicing in this sweet, beautiful world, in its fair, incessant variety, its satisfaction, its opportunities, exultant in this glorious gift of life. Had I the power of music, I would make a world-wide motif, swell and amplify, gather to itself this theme and that, and rise at last to sheer ecstasy of triumph and rejoicing. It should be all sound, all pride, all the hope of outsetting in the morning brightness, all the glee of unexpected happenings, all the gladness of painful effort suddenly come to its reward. It should be like blossoms new opened and the happy play of children, like tearful, happy mothers holding their firstborn, like cities building to the sound of music, and great ships, all hung with flags and wine bespattered, gliding down through cheering multitudes to their first meeting with the sea. Through it all should march hope, confident hope, radiant and invincible, until at last it would be the triumph march of hope, the conqueror coming with trumpetings and banners through the wide-flung gates of the world. And then out of that luminous haze of gladness comes Nettie, transfigured. So she came again to me, amazing, a thing incredibly forgotten. She comes back, and Verrall is in her company. She comes back into my memories now, just as she came back then, rather quaintly at first not seen very clearly, a little distorted by intervening things, seen with a doubt, as I saw her through the slightly discolored panes of crinkled glass in the window of the Menton post office and grocer's shop. It was on the second day after the change, and I had been sending telegrams for Melmount, who was making arrangements for his departure for Downing Street. I saw the two of them at first as small, flawed figures. The glass made them seem curved, and it enhanced and altered their gestures and paces. I felt it became me to say peace to them, and I went out to the jangling of the doorbell. At the sight of me they stopped short, and Verrall cried with a note of one who has sought, "Here he is!" and Nettie cried, "Willie!" I went toward them, and all the perspectives, my reconstructed universe, altered as I did so. I seemed to see these two for the first time. How fine they were, how graceful and human. It was as though I had never really looked at them before, and indeed always before I had beheld them through a mist of selfish passion. They had shared the universal darkness and dwarfing of the former time. They shared the universal exaltation of the new. Now suddenly Nettie, and the love of Nettie, a great passion for Nettie, lived again in me. This change, which had enlarged men's hearts, had made no end to love. Indeed, it had enormously enlarged and glorified love. She stepped into the center of that dream of world reconstruction that filled my mind and took possession of it all. A little wisp of hair had blown across her cheek. Her lips fell apart in that sweet smile of hers. Her eyes were full of wonder, of a welcoming scrutiny, of an infinitely courageous friendliness. I took her outstretched hands, and wonder overwhelmed me. "I wanted to kill you," I said simply, trying to grasp that idea. It seemed now like stabbing the stars or murdering the sunlight. "Afterward we looked for you," said Verrall, "and we could not find you. We heard another shot." I turned my eyes to him, and Nettie's hand fell from me. It was then I thought of how they had fallen together, and what it must have been to have awakened in that dawn with Nettie by one side. I had a vision of them as I had glimpsed them last amidst the thickening vapors, close together, hand in hand. The green hawks of the change spread their darkling wings above their last stumbling paces. So they fell and awoke, lovers together in a morning of paradise. Who can tell how bright the sunshine was to them, how fair the flowers, how sweet the singing of the birds? This was the thought of my heart, but my lips were saying, when I awoke I threw my pistol away. Sheer blankness kept my thoughts silent for a little while. I said empty things. "I'm very glad I did not kill you, that you are here, so fair and well. I am going away back to Clayton on the day after tomorrow," I said, breaking away to explanations. "I've been writing shorthand here for Melmount, but that is almost over now." Neither of them said a word, and though all facts had suddenly ceased to matter anything, I went on informatively. "He's to be taken to Downing Street, where there is a proper staff, so that there will be no need of me. Of course you're a little perplexed at my being with Melmount. You see, I met him by accident directly I recovered. I found him with a broken ankle in that lane." I am to go now to the 4 towns to help prepare a report, so that I am glad to see you both again. I found a catch in my voice. To say good-bye to you and wish you well. This was after the quality of what had come into my mind when first I saw them through the grocer's window, but it was not what I felt and thought as I said it. I went on saying it because otherwise there would have been a gap. It had come to me that it was going to be hard to part from Nettie. My words sounded with an effect of unreality. I stopped, and we stood for a moment in silence, looking at one another. It was I think, who was discovering most. I was realizing for the first time how little the change had altered in my essential nature. I had forgotten this business of love for a time in a world of wonder. That was all. Nothing was lost from my nature, nothing had gone. Only the power of thought and restraint had been wonderfully increased, and new interests had been forced upon me. The green vapors had passed. Our minds were swept and garnished, but we were ourselves still, though living in a new and finer air. My affinities were unchanged. Nettie's personal charm for me was only quickened by the enhancement of my perceptions. In her presence, meeting her eyes, instantly my desire, no longer frantic but sane, was awake again. It was just like going to Checkshill in the old time after writing about socialism. I relinquished her hand. It was absurd to part in these terms. So we all felt it. We hung awkwardly over our sense of that. It was Verrall, I think, who shaped the thought for me, and said that tomorrow, then, we must meet and say good-bye, and so turned our encounter into a transitory making of arrangements. We settled we would come to the inn at Menton, all 3 of us, and take our midday meal together. Yes, it was clear. That was all we had to say now. We parted a little awkwardly. I went on down the village street, not looking back, surprised at myself and infinitely perplexed. It was as if I had discovered something overlooked that disarranged all my plans, something entirely disconcerting. For the first time I went back preoccupied and without eagerness to Melmount's work. I wanted to go on thinking about Nettie. My mind had suddenly become voluminously productive concerning her and Verrall. End of Book 3, Chapter 1, Section 1. Book 3, Chapter 1, Sections 2 and 3 of In the Days of the Comet. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. In the Days of the Comet by H.G. Wells. Book 3, Chapter 1, Sections 2 and 3. The talk we 3 had together in the dawn of the new time is very strongly impressed upon my memory. There was something fresh and simple about it, something young and flushed and exalted. We took up, we handled with a certain naive timidity, the most difficult questions the change had raised for men to solve. I recall we made little of them. All the old scheme of human life had dissolved and passed away. The narrow competitiveness, the greed and base aggression, the jealous aloofness of soul from soul. Where had it left us? That was what we and 1,000 million others were discussing. It chances that this last meeting with Nettie is inseparably associated, I don't know why, with the landlady of the Menton Inn. The Menton Inn was one of the rare, pleasant corners of the old order. It was an inn of unusual prosperity, much frequented by visitors from Shaphambury, and given to the serving of lunches and teas. It had a broad, mossy bowling green, and round about it were creeper-covered arbours amidst beds of snapdragon and hollyhock and blue delphinium, and many such tall, familiar summer flowers. These stood out against a background of laurels and holly, and above these again rose the gables of the inn and its signpost, a white-horsed George slaying the dragon against copper beeches under the sky. While I waited for Nettie and Verrill in this agreeable trysting-place, I talked to the landlady, a broad-shouldered, smiling, freckled woman, about the morning of the change. That motherly, abundant, red-haired figure of health was buoyantly sure that everything in the world was now to be changed for the better. That confidence and something in her voice made me love her as I talked to her. "Now we're awake," she said, "all sorts of things will be put right that hadn't any sense in them. Why? Oh, I'm sure of it." Her kind blue eyes met mine in an infinitude of friendliness, her lips in her pauses shaped in a pretty faint smile. Old tradition was still strong in us. All English inns in those days charged the unexpected, and I asked what our lunch was to cost. "Pay or not," she said, "and what you like. It's holiday these days. I suppose we'll still have paying and charging, however we manage it, but it won't be the worry it has been, that I feel sure. It's the part I never had no fancy for. Many a time I peeped through the bushes, worrying to think what was just and right to me and mine, and what would send 'em away satisfied. It isn't the money I care for. There'll be mighty changes, be sure of that, but here I'll stay and make people happy, them that go by on the roads. It's a pleasant place here when people are merry. It's only when they're jealous or mean or tired or eat up beyond any stomach's digesting, or when they got the drink in 'em, that Satan comes into this garden. Many's the happy face I've seen here, and many that come again like friends, but nothing to equal what's going to be now things are being set right." She smiled, that bounteous woman, with the joy of life and hope. "You shall have an omelette," she said, "you and your friends, such an omelette like they'll have 'em in heaven. I feel there's cooking in me these days like I've never cooked before. I'm rejoiced to have it to do." It was just then that Nettie and Verrill appeared under a rustic archway of crimson roses that led out from the inn. Nettie wore white and a sun hat, and Verrill was a figure of grey. "Here are my friends," I said, but for all the magic of the change, something passed athwart the sunlight in my soul, like the passing of the shadow of a cloud. "A pretty couple," said the landlady, as they crossed the velvet green toward us. They were indeed a pretty couple, but that did not greatly gladden me. No, I winced a little at that. Section 3. This old newspaper, this first reissue of the new paper, desiccated last relic of a vanished age, is like the little piece of identification the superstitious of the old days, those queer religionists who brought a certain black-clad Mrs. Piper to the help of Christ, used to put into the hand of a clairvoyant. At the crisp touch of it, I look across a gulf of 50 years and see again the three of us sitting about that table in the arbor, and I smell again the smell of the sweet briar that filled the air about us, and hear in our long pauses the abundant murmuring of bees among the heliotrope of the borders. It is the dawn of the new time, but we bear, all three of us, the marks and liveries of the old. I see myself, a dark, ill-dressed youth, with the bruise Lord Redcar gave me still blue and yellow beneath my jaw, and young Verrill sits cornerwise to me, better grown, better dressed, fair and quiet, 2 years my senior indeed, but looking no older than I because of his light complexion. And opposite me is Nettie, with dark eyes upon my face, graver and more beautiful than I had ever seen her in the former time. Her dress is still that white one she had worn when I came upon her in the park, and still about her dainty neck she wears her string of pearls and that little coin of gold. She is so much the same. She is so changed. A girl then, and now a woman, and all my agony and all the marvel of the change between. Over the end of the green table about which we sit, a spotless cloth is spread. It bears a pleasant lunch, spread out with a simple equipage. Behind me is the liberal sunshine of the green and various garden. I see it all. Again I sit there eating awkwardly. This paper lies upon the table, and Verrill talks of the change. "You can't imagine," he says in his sure, fine accents, "how much the change has destroyed of me. I still don't feel awake. Men of my sort are so tremendously made. I never suspected it before." He leans over the table toward me with an evident desire to make himself perfectly understood. "I find myself like some creature that is taken out of its shell, soft and new. I was trained to dress in a certain way, to behave in a certain way, to think in a certain way. I see now it's all wrong and narrow, most of it anyhow. A system of class shibboleths. We were decent to each other in order to be a gang to the rest of the world. Gentlemen indeed, but it's perplexing." I can hear his voice saying that now, and see the lift of his eyebrows and his pleasant smile. He paused. He had wanted to say that, but it was not the thing we had to say. I leaned forward a little and took hold of my glass very tightly. "You two," I said, "will marry?" They looked at one another. Nettie spoke very softly. "I did not mean to marry when I came away," she said. "I know," I answered. I looked up with a sense of effort and met Verrill's eyes. He answered me. "I think we two have joined our lives, but the thing that took us was a sort of madness." I nodded. "All passion," I said, "is madness." Then I fell into a doubting of those words. "Why did we do these things?" he said, turning to her suddenly. Her hands were clasped under her chin, her eyes downcast. "We had to," she said, with her old trick of inadequate expression. Then she seemed to open out suddenly. "Willie," she cried with a sudden directness, with her eyes appealing to me, "I didn't mean to treat you badly. Indeed I didn't. I kept thinking of you and of father and mother all the time, only it didn't seem to move me. It didn't move me not one bit from the way I had chosen." "Chosen," I said. "Something seemed to have hold of me," she admitted. "It's all so unaccountable." She gave a little gesture of despair. Verrill's fingers played on the cloth for a space. Then he turned his face to me again. "Something said, 'Take her,' everything. It was a raging desire for her. I don't know. Everything contributed to that, or counted for nothing. You——" "Go on," said I. "When I knew of you——" I looked at Nettie. "You never told him about me?" I said, feeling, as it were, a sting out of the old time. Verrill answered for her. "No, but things dropped. I saw you that night. My instincts were all awake. I knew it was you." "You triumphed over me. If I could, I would have triumphed over you," I said. "But go on." "Everything conspired to make it the finest thing in life. It had an air of generous recklessness. It meant mischief. It might mean failure in that life of politics and affairs for which I was trained, which it was my honor to follow. That made it all the finer. It meant ruin or misery for Nettie. That made it all the finer. No sane or decent man would have approved of what we did. That made it more splendid than ever. I had all the advantages of position and used them basely. That mattered not at all." "Yes," I said, "it is true. And the same dark wave that lifted you swept me on to follow, with that revolver and blubbering with hate. And the word to you, Nettie, what was it? Give, hurl yourself down the steep." Nettie's hands fell upon the table. "I can't tell what it was," she said, speaking bare-hearted straight to me. "Girls aren't trained as men are trained to look into their minds. I can't see it yet. All sorts of mean little motives were there, over and above the must. Mean motives. I kept thinking of his clothes." She smiled, a flash of brightness at Verrill. "I kept thinking of being like a lady and sitting in a hotel with men like butlers waiting. It's the dreadful truth, Willie. Things as mean as that. Things meaner than that." I can see her now pleading with me, speaking with a frankness as bright and amazing as the dawn of the first great morning. "It wasn't all mean," I said slowly, after a pause. "No," they spoke together. "But a woman chooses more than a man does," Nettie added. "I saw it all in little bright pictures. Do you know that jacket? There's something. You won't mind my telling you, but you won't now." I nodded no. She spoke as if she spoke to my soul, very quietly and very earnestly, seeking to give the truth. "Something cottony in that cloth of yours," she said. "I know there's something horrible in being swung round by things like that, but they did swing me round in the old time, to have confessed that. And I hated Clayton and the grime of it, that kitchen, your mother's dreadful kitchen. And besides, Willie, I was afraid of you. I didn't understand you, and I did him. It's different now, but then I knew what he meant, and there was his voice." "Yes," I said to Verrall, making these discoveries quietly. "Yes, Verrall, you have a good voice. Queer, I never thought of that before." We sat silently for a time before our vivisected passions. "Gods!" I cried. And there was our poor little top hamper of intelligence on all these waves of instinct and wordless desire, these foaming things of touch and sight and feeling, like a coop of hens washed overboard and clucking amidst the seas. Verrall laughed approval of the image I had struck out. "A week ago," he said, trying it further, "we were clinging to our chicken coops and going with the heave and pour. That was true enough a week ago. But today," I said, "the wind has fallen, the world's storm is over, and each chicken coop has changed by a miracle to a vessel that makes head against the sea." End of Book 3, Chapter 1, Sections 2 and 3. Book 3, Chapter 1, Section 4, of In the Days of the Comet. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. In the Days of the Comet by H.G. Wells. Book 3, Chapter 1, Section 4. "What are we to do?" asked Verrall. Nettie drew a deep crimson carnation from the bowl before us, and began very neatly and deliberately to turn down the sepals of its calyx and remove one by one its petals. I remember that went on through all our talk. She put those ragged crimson shreds in a long row and adjusted them and readjusted them. When at last I was alone with these vestiges, the pattern was still incomplete. "Well," said I, "the matter seems fairly simple. You two—" I swallowed it. "Love one another." I paused. They answered me by silence, by a thoughtful silence. "You belong to each other. I've thought it over and looked at it from many points of view. I happen to want impossible things. I behaved badly. I had no right to pursue you." I turned to Verrall. "You hold yourself bound to her?" He nodded assent. "No social influence, no fading out of all this generous clearness in the air, for that might happen, will change you back?" He answered me with honest eyes meeting mine. "No, Ledford, no." "I did not know you," I said. "I thought of you as something very different from this." "I was," he interpolated. "Now," I said, "it's all changed." Then I halted, for my thread had slipped away from me. As for me, I went on and glanced at Nettie's downcast face, and then sat forward with my eyes upon the flowers between us. Since I am swayed and shall be swayed by an affection for Nettie, since that affection is rich with the seeds of desire, since to see her yours and wholly yours is not to be endured by me, I must turn about and go from you. You must avoid me and I you. We must divide the world like Jacob and Esau. I must direct myself with all the will I have to other things. After all, this passion is not life. It is perhaps for brutes and savages, but for men. No, we must part, and I must forget. What else is there but that?" I did not look up. I sat very tense with the red petals printing an indelible memory in my brain. But I felt the accent of Verrall's pose. There were some moments of silence, and then Nettie spoke. "But," she said, and ceased. I waited for a little while. I sighed and leaned back in my chair. "It is perfectly simple," I smiled, "now that we have cool heads." "But is it simple?" asked Nettie, and slashed my discourse out of being. I looked up and found her with her eyes on Verrall. "You see," she said, "I like Willie. It's hard to say what one feels, but I don't want him to go away like that." "But then," objected Verrall, "how?" "No," said Nettie, and swept her half-arranged carnation petals back into a heap of confusion. She began to arrange them very quickly in one long straight line. "It's so difficult. I've never before in all my life tried to get to the bottom of my mind. For one thing, I've not treated Willie properly. He counted on me. I know he did. I was his hope. I was a promised delight, something to crown life, better than anything he had ever had. And a secret pride. He lived upon me. I knew when we two began to meet together, you and I, it was a sort of treachery to him." "Treachery?" I said. "You were only feeling your way through all these perplexities." "You thought it treachery." "I don't know." "I did. In a sense I think so still, for you had need of me." I made a slight protest at this doctrine, but fell thinking. "And even when he was trying to kill us," she said to her lover, "I felt for him down in the bottom of my mind. I can understand all the horrible things, the humiliation he went through." "Yes," I said, "but I don't see. I'm only trying to see. But you know, Willie, you are a part of my life. I have known you longer than I have known Edward. I know you better. Indeed, I know you with all my heart. You think all your talk was thrown away upon me, that I never understood that side of you, or your ambitions, or anything. I did, more than I thought at the time. Now it is all clear to me. What I had to understand in you was something deeper than Edward brought me. I have it now. You are a part of my life, and I don't want to cut all that off from me now that I have comprehended it, and throw it away." "But you love Verrall." "Love is such a queer thing. Is there one love? I mean only one love?" She turned to Verrall. "I know I love you. I can speak out about that now. Before this morning I couldn't have done. It's just as though my mind had got out of a scented prison. But what is it, this love for you? It's a mass of fancies, things about you, ways you look, ways you have. It's the senses, and the senses of certain beauties. Flattery too, things you said, hopes and deceptions for myself. And all that had rolled up together and taken to itself the wild help of those deep emotions that slumbered in my body. It seemed everything, but it wasn't. How can I describe it? It was like having a very bright lamp with a thick shade. Everything else in the room was hidden, but you take the shade off, and there they are. It is the same light, still there, only it lights everyone." Her voice ceased. For a while no one spoke, and Nettie, with a quick movement, swept the petals into the shape of a pyramid. Figures of speech always distract me, and it ran through my mind like some puzzling refrain. "It is still the same light." "No woman believes these things," she asserted abruptly. "What things?" "No woman ever has believed them." "You have to choose a man," said Verrall, apprehending her before I did. "We're brought up to that. We're told. It's in the books, in stories, in the way people look, in the way they behave. One day there'll come a man. He'll be everything. No one else will be anything. Leave everything else. Live in him." "And the man, too, is taught that of some woman," said Verrall. "Only men don't believe it. They have more obstinate minds. Men have never behaved as though they believed it. One need not be old to know that. By nature they don't believe it. But a woman believes nothing by nature. She goes into a mold, hiding her secret thoughts, almost from herself." "She used to," I said. "You haven't," said Verrall, "anyhow." "I've come out. It's this comet. and Willie, and because I never really believed in the mold at all, even if I thought I did. It's stupid to send Willie off, shamed, cast out, never to see him again, when I like him as much as I do. It's cruel, it's wicked and ugly to prance over him as if he was a defeated enemy, and pretend I'm going to be happy just the same. There's no sense in a rule of life that prescribes that. It's selfish, it's brutish, it's like something that has no sense. There was a sob in her voice. Willie, I won't. I sat lowering. I mused with my eyes upon her quick fingers. It is brutish, I said at last with a careful, unemotional deliberation. Nevertheless, it is in the nature of things. No. You see, after all, we are still half-brutes, Nettie, and men, as you say, are more obstinate than women. The Comet hasn't altered that. It's only made it clearer. We have come into being through a tumult of blind forces. I come back to what I said just now. We have found our poor reasonable minds, our wills to live well ourselves, adrift on a wash of instincts, passions, instinctive prejudices, half-animal stupidities. Here we are like people clinging to something, like people awakening upon a raft. We come back at last to my question, said Verrall softly. What are we to do? Part, I said. You see, Nettie, these bodies of ours are not the bodies of angels. They are the same bodies. I've read somewhere that in our bodies you can find evidence of the lowliest ancestry, that about our inward ears, I think it is, and about our teeth, there remains still something of the fish, that there are bones that recall little, marsupial forebears, and 100 traces of the ape. Even your beautiful body, Nettie, carries this taint. No, hear me out. I leaned forward earnestly. Our emotions, our passions, our desires, the substance of them, like the substance of our bodies, is an animal, a competing thing, as well as a desiring thing. You speak to us now, a mind to minds. One can do that when one has had exercise, and when one has eaten, when one is not doing anything. But when one turns to live, one turns again to matter. Yes, said Nettie, slowly following me, but you control it only through a measure of obedience. There is no magic in the business to conquer matter. We must divide the enemy and take matter as an ally. Nowadays, it is indeed true, by faith a man can remove mountains. He can say to a mountain, be thou removed, and be thou cast into the sea. But he does it because he helps and trusts his brother men, because he has the wit and patience and courage to win over to his side iron, steel, obedience, dynamite, cranes, trucks, the money of other people. To conquer my desire for you, I must not perpetually thwart it by your presence. I must go away so that I may not see you. I must take up other interests, thrust myself into struggles and discussions. And forget, said Nettie. Not forget, I said, but anyhow cease to brood upon you. She hung on that for some moments. No, she said, demolished her last pattern and looked up at Verrall as he stirred. Verrall leant forward on the table, elbows upon it, and the fingers of his 2 hands intertwined. You know, he said, I haven't thought much of these things. At school and the university one doesn't. It was part of the system to prevent it. They'll alter all that, no doubt. We seem, he thought, to be skating about over questions that one came to at last in Greek, with variorum readings in Plato, but which it never occurred to anyone to translate out of a dead language into living realities. He halted and answered some unspoken question from his own mind with, no, I think with Ledford, Nettie, that, as he put it, it's in the nature of things for men to be exclusive. Minds are free things and go about the world, but only one man can possess a woman. You must dismiss rivals. We are made for the struggle for existence. We are the struggle for existence. The things that live are the struggle for existence incarnate, and that works out that the men struggle for their mates. For each woman one prevails, the others go away. Like animals, said Nettie. Yes. There are many things in life, I said, but that is the rough, universal truth. "But," said Nettie, "you don't struggle. That has been altered because men have minds." "You choose," I said. "If I don't choose to choose?" "You have chosen." She gave a little impatient "Oh, why are women always the slaves of sex? Is this the great age of reason and light that has come to alter nothing of that, and men too? I think it is all stupid. I do not believe this is the right solution of the thing, or anything but the bad habits of the time that was. Instinct! You don't let your instincts rule you in a lot of other things. Here am I between you. Here is Edward. I love him because he is gay, pleasant, and because I like him. Here is Willie, a part of me, my first secret, my oldest friend. Why must I not have both? Am I not a mind that you must think of me as nothing but a woman? Imagine me always as a thing to struggle for?" She paused, and then she made her distressful proposition to me. "Let us three keep together," she said. "Let us not part. To part is hate, Willie. Why should we not anyhow keep friends, meet and talk?" "Talk?" I said. "About this sort of thing?" I looked across at Verrall and met his eyes, and we studied one another. It was the clean, straight scrutiny of honest antagonism. "No," I decided, "between us nothing of that sort can be." "Ever?" said Nettie. "Never," I said, convinced. I made an effort within myself. "We cannot tamper with the law and custom of these things," I said. "These passions are too close to one's essential self. Better surgery than a lingering disease. From Nettie my love asks all. A man's love is not devotion. It is a demand, a challenge. And besides," and here I forced my theme, "I have given myself now to a new mistress. And it is I, Nettie, who am unfaithful. Behind you and above you rises the coming city of the world, and I am in that building. Dear heart, you are only happiness, and that, indeed, that calls. If it is only that my life blood shall christen the foundation stones, I could almost hope that should be my part. Nettie, I will join myself in that." I threw all the conviction I could into these words. "No conflict of passion," I added a little lamely, "must distract me." There was a pause. "Then we must part," said Nettie, with the eyes of a woman one strikes in the face. I nodded assent. There was a little pause, and then I stood up. We stood up, all three. We parted, almost sullenly, with no more memorable words, and I was left presently in the arbour alone. I do not think I watched them go. I only remember myself left there somehow, horribly empty and alone. I sat down again and fell into a deep, shapeless musing. End of Book 3, Chapter 1, Section 4. Book 3, Chapter 1, Sections 5 and 6 of In the Days of the Comet. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. In the Days of the Comet by H.G. Wells. Book 3, Chapter 1, Sections 5 and 6. Suddenly I looked up. Nettie had come back and stood looking down at me. "Since we talked, I have been thinking," she said. "Edward has let me come to you alone, and I feel perhaps I can talk better to you alone." I said nothing, and that embarrassed her. "I don't think we ought to part," she said. "No, I don't think we ought to part," she repeated. "One lives," she said, "in different ways. I wonder if you'll understand what I'm saying, Willie. It's hard to say what I feel, but I want it said. If we're to part for ever, I want it said very plainly. Always before I have had the woman's instinct and the woman's training which makes one hide. But Edward is not all of me. Think of what I'm saying. Edward is not all of me. I wish I could tell you better how I see it. I am not all of myself. You, at any rate, are a part of me, and I cannot bear to leave you. And I cannot see why I should leave you. There's a sort of blood link between us, Willie. We grew together. We are in one another's bones. I understand you. Now, indeed, I understand in some way. I have come to an understanding at a stride. Indeed, I understand you and your dream. I want to help you. Edward has no dreams. It is dreadful to me, Willie, to think we two are to part. But we've settled that. Part we must. But why? I love you. Well, and why should I hide it, Willie? I love you. Our eyes met. She flushed. She went on resolutely. You are stupid. The whole thing is stupid. I love you both. I said, you do not understand what you say. No. You mean that I must go? Yes, go. For a moment we looked at one another mute, as though deep down in the unfathomable darkness below the surface and present reality of things dumb meaning strove to be. She made to speak and desisted. But must I go? She said at last, with quivering lips, and the tears in her eyes were stars. Then she began, Willie, go. I interrupted her. Yes. Then again we were still. She stood there, a tearful figure of pity, longing for me, pitying me. Something of that wider love that will carry our descendants at last out of all the limits, the hard, clear obligations of our personal life, moved us, like the first breath of a coming wind out of heaven that stirs and passes away. I had an impulse to take her hand and kiss it, and then a trembling came to me, and I knew that if I touched her, my strength would all pass from me. And so, standing at a distance one from the other, we parted, and Nettie went reluctant and looking back, with the man she had chosen, to the lot she had chosen, out of my life, like the sunlight, out of my life. Then, you know, I suppose I folded up this newspaper and put it in my pocket, but my memory of that meeting ends with the face of Nettie turning to go. Section 6. I remember all that very distinctly to this day. I could almost vouch for the words I have put into our several mouths. And then comes a blank. I have a dim memory of being back in the house near the links, and the bustle of Melmount's departure, of finding Parker's energy distasteful, and of going away down the road with a strong desire to say good-bye to Melmount alone. Perhaps I was already doubting my decision to part forever from Nettie, for I think I had it in mind to tell him all that had been said and done. I don't think I had a word with him, or anything but a hurried hand-clasp. I'm not sure. It has gone out of my mind, but I have a very clear and certain memory of my phase of bleak desolation as I watched his car recede and climb and vanish over Mapleborough Hill, and that I got there my first full and definite intimation that, after all, this great change and my new wide aims in life were not to mean indiscriminate happiness for me. I had a sense of protest as against extreme unfairness as I saw him go. It is too soon, I said to myself, to leave me alone. I felt I had sacrificed too much, that after I had said good-bye to the hot, immediate life of passion, to Nettie and desire, to physical and personal rivalry, to all that was most intensely myself, it was wrong to leave me alone and sore-hearted, to go on at once with these steely, cold duties of the wider life. I felt new-born and naked and at a loss. "Work," I said with an effort at the heroic, and turned about with a sigh, and I was glad that the way I had to go would at least take me to my mother. But curiously enough, I remember myself as being fairly cheerful in the town of Birmingham that night. I recall an active and interested mood. I spent the night in Birmingham because the train service on was disarranged and I could not get on. I went to listen to a band that was playing its brassy old world music in the public park, and I fell into a conversation with a man who said he had been a reporter upon one of their minor local papers. He was full and keen upon all the plans of reconstruction that were now shaping over the lives of humanity. And I know that something of that noble dream came back to me with his words and phrases. We walked up to a place called Bourneville by moonlight, and talked of the new social groupings that must replace the old isolated homes, and how the people would be housed. This Bourneville was germane to that matter. It had been an attempt on the part of a private firm of manufacturers to improve the housing of their workers. To our ideas today it would seem the feeblest of benevolent efforts, but at the time it was extraordinary and famous, and people came long journeys to see its trim cottages with baths sunk under the kitchen floors of all conceivable places, and other brilliant inventions. No one seemed to see the danger to liberty in that aggressive age that might arise through making work-people tenants and debtors of their employer, though an act called the Truck Act had long ago intervened to prevent minor developments in the same direction. But I and my chance acquaintance seemed that night always to have been aware of that possibility, and we had no doubt in our minds of the public nature of the housing duty. Our interest lay rather in the possibility of common nurseries and kitchens and public rooms that should economize toil and give people space and freedom. It was very interesting, but still a little cheerless, and when I lay in bed that night I thought of Nettie and the queer modifications of preference she had made, and among other things, and in a way, I prayed. I prayed that night, let me confess it, to an image I had set up in my heart, an image that still serves with me as a symbol for things inconceivable, to a master artificer, the unseen captain of all who go about building of the world, the making of mankind. But before and after I prayed, I imagined I was talking and reasoning and meeting again with Nettie. She never came into the temple of that worshipping with me. End of Book 3, Chapter 1, Sections 5 and 6. Book 3, Chapter 2, Sections 1, 2, and 3 of In the Days of the Comet. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. In the Days of the Comet by H. G. Wells. Book 3, Chapter 2, Sections 1, 2, and 3. Next day I came home to Clayton. The new, strange brightness of the world was all the brighter there, for the host of dark, distressful memories, of darkened childhood, toilsome youth, embittered adolescence, that wove about the place for me. It seemed to me that I saw that morning there for the first time. No chimneys smoked that day, no furnaces were burning, the people were busy with other things. The clear, strong sun, the sparkle in the dustless air, made a strange gaiety in the narrow streets. I passed a number of smiling people coming home from the public breakfasts that were given in the town hall until better things could be arranged, and happened on Parload among them. "You were right about that Comet," I sang out at the sight of him, and he came toward me and clasped my hand. "What are people doing here?" said I. "They're sending us food from outside," he said, "and we're going to level all these slums and shift into tents on to the moors." And he began to tell me of many things that were being arranged. The Midland Land Committees had got to work with remarkable celerity and directness of purpose, and the redistribution of population was already in its broad outlines planned. He was working at an improvised college of engineering until schemes of work were made out. Almost everyone was going to school again to get as much technical training as they could against the demands of the huge enterprise of reconstruction that was now beginning. He walked with me to my door, and there I met old Pettigrew coming down the steps. He looked dusty and tired, but his eye was brighter than it used to be, and he carried in a rather unaccustomed manner a workman's tool basket. "How's the rheumatism, Mr. Pettigrew?" I asked. "Dietary," said old Pettigrew, "can work wonders." He looked me in the eye. "These houses," he said, "will have to come down, I suppose, and our notions of property must undergo very considerable revision, in the light of reason. But meanwhile I've been doing something to patch that disgraceful roof of mine. To think that I could have dodged and evaded!" He raised a deprecatory hand, drew down the loose corners of his ample mouth, and shook his old head. "The past is past, Mr. Pettigrew. Your poor dear mother, so good and honest a woman, so simple and kind and forgiving. To think of it! My dear young man," he said it manfully, "I'm ashamed." "The whole world blushed at dawn the other day, Mr. Pettigrew," I said, "and did it very prettily. That's over now. God knows who is not ashamed of all that came before last Tuesday." I held out a forgiving hand, naively forgetful that in this place I was a thief, and he took it and went his way, shaking his head and repeating he was ashamed, but I think a little comforted. The door opened, and my poor old mother's face, marvellously cleaned, appeared. "Ah, Willie boy, you!" I ran up the steps to her, for I feared she might fall. How she clung to me in the passage, the dear woman! But first she shut the front door. The old habit of respect for my unaccountable temper still swayed her. "Ah, dearie," she said, "ah, dearie." But you were sorely tried, and kept her face close to my shoulder, lest she should offend me by the sight of the tears that welled within her. She made a sort of gulping noise, and was quiet for a while, holding me very tightly to her heart with her worn, long hands. She thanked me presently for my telegram, and I put my arm about her and drew her into the living room. "It's all well with me, mother dear," I said, "and the dark times are over, are done with for ever, mother." Whereupon she had courage and gave way and sobbed aloud, none chiding her. She had not let me know she could still weep for 5 grimy years. Section 2. Dear heart, there remained for her but a very brief while in this world that had been renewed. I did not know how short that time would be, but the little I could do, perhaps after all it was not little to her, to atone for the harshness of my days of wrath and rebellion, I did. I took care to be constantly with her, for I perceived now her curious need of me. It was not that we had ideas to exchange or pleasures to share, but she liked to see me at the table, to watch me working, to have me go to and fro. There was no toil for her any more in the world, but only such light services as are easy and pleasant for a worn and weary old woman to do, and I think she was happy even at her end. She kept to her queer old 18th century version of religion, too, without a change. She had worn this particular amulet so long it was a part of her, yet the change was evident even in that persistence. I said to her one day, "But do you still believe in that hell of flame, dear mother? You, with your tender heart?" She vowed she did. Some theological intricacy made it necessary to her, but still. She looked thoughtfully at a bank of primulas before her for a time, and laid her tremulous hand impressively on my arm. "You know, Willie dear," she said, as though she was clearing up a childish misunderstanding of mine, "I don't think anyone will go there. I never did think that." Section 3. That talk stands out in my memory because of that agreeable theological decision of hers. But it was only one of a great number of talks. It used to be pleasant in the afternoon, after the day's work was done, and before one went out with the evening study. How odd it would have seemed in the old time for a young man of the industrial class to be doing post-graduate work in sociology, and how much a matter of course it seems now, to walk out into the gardens of Lowchester House and smoke a cigarette or so, and let her talk ramblingly of the things that interested her. Physically, the great change did not do so very much to reinvigorate her. She had lived in that dismal underground kitchen in Clayton too long for any material rejuvenescence. She glowed out indeed as a dying spark among the ashes might glow under a draught of fresh air, and assuredly it hastened her end, for those closing days were very tranquil, full of an effortless contentment. With her, life was like a rainy, windy day that clears only to show the sunset afterglow. The light has passed. She acquired no new habits amid the comforts of the new life, did no new things, but only found a happier light upon the old. She lived with a number of other old ladies belonging to our commune in the upper rooms of Lowchester House. Those upper apartments were simple and ample, fine and well done in the Georgian style, and they had been organized to give the maximum of comfort and conveniences and to economize the need of skilled attendance. We had taken over the various great houses, as they used to be called, to make communal dining rooms and so forth. Their kitchens were conveniently large and pleasant places for the old people of over 60, whose time of ease had come, and for such like public uses. We had done this not only with Lord Redcar's house, but also with Cheekskill House, where old Mrs. Verrill made a dignified and capable hostess, and indeed with most of the fine residences in the beautiful wide country between the Four Towns district and the Welsh mountains. About these great houses there had usually been good outbuildings, laundries, married servants' quarters, stabling, dairies, and the like, suitably masked by trees. We turned these into homes, and to them we added first tents and wood chalets, and afterward quadrangular residential buildings. In order to be near my mother, I had 2 small rooms in the new collegiate buildings, which our commune was almost the first to possess, and they were very convenient for the station of the high-speed electric railway that took me down to our daily conferences and my secretarial and statistical work in Clayton. Ours had been one of the first modern communes to get in order. We were greatly helped by the energy of Lord Redcar, who had a fine feeling for the picturesque associations of his ancestral home. The detour that took our line through the beeches and bracken and bluebells of the West Wood, and saved the pleasant open wildness of the park, was one of his suggestions, and we had many reasons to be proud of our surroundings. Nearly all the other communes that sprang up all over the pleasant parkland round the industrial valley of the Four Towns, as the workers moved out, came to us to study the architecture of the residential squares and quadrangles with which we had replaced the back streets between the great houses and the ecclesiastical residences about the cathedral, and the way in which we had adapted all these buildings to our new social needs. Some claimed to have improved on us, but they could not emulate the rhododendron garden out beyond our shrubberies. That was a thing altogether our own in our part of England, because of its ripeness and the rarity of good peat free from lime. These gardens had been planned under the 3rd Lord Redcar 50 years ago and more. They abounded in rhododendra and azaleas, and were in places so well sheltered and sunny that great magnolias flourished and flowered. There were tall trees smothered in crimson and yellow climbing roses, and an endless variety of flowering shrubs and fine conifers, and such pampas grass as no other garden can show. And barred by the broad shadows of these were glades and broad spaces of emerald turf, and here and there banks of pegged roses and flower beds, and banks given over, some to spring bulbs and some to primroses and primulas and polyanthuses. My mother loved these latter banks, and the little round staring eyes of their innumerable yellow, ruddy brown, and purple corollas, more than anything else the gardens could show. And in the spring of the year of scaffolding, she would go with me day after day to the seat that showed them in the greatest multitude. It gave her, I think, among other agreeable impressions, a sense of gentle opulence. In the old time she had never known what it was to have more than enough of anything agreeable in the world at all. We would sit and think or talk, and there was a curious effect of complete understanding between us, whether we talked or were still. "Heaven," she said to me one day, "heaven is a garden." I was moved to tease her a little. "There's jewels, you know, walls and gates of jewels, and singing, for such as like them," said my mother firmly, and thought for a while. "There'll be things for all of us, of course, but for me it couldn't be heaven, dear, unless it was a garden, a nice sunny garden, and feelings such as we're fond of are close and handy by. You of your happier generation cannot realize the wonderfulness of those early days in the new epoch, the sense of security, the extraordinary effects of contrast. In the morning, except in high summer, I was up before dawn and breakfasted upon the swift, smooth train, and perhaps saw the sunrise as I rushed out of the little tunnel that pierced Clayton Crest, and so to work like a man. Now that we had got all the homes and schools and all the softness of life away from our coal and iron ore and clay, now that 1,000 obstructive rights and timidities had been swept aside, we could let ourselves go. We merged this enterprise with that, cut across this or that anciently obstructive piece of private land, joined and separated, effected gigantic consolidations and gigantic economies, and the valley, no longer a pit of squalid human tragedies and meanly conflicting industries, grew into a sort of beauty of its own, a savage inhuman beauty of force and machinery and flames. One was a Titan in that Etna, and then back one came at midday to bath and change in the train, and so to the leisurely gossiping lunch in the club dining-room in Lowchester House, and the refreshment of these green and sunlit afternoon tranquillities. Sometimes in her profounder moments my mother doubted whether all this last phase of her life was not a dream. A dream, I used to say, a dream indeed, but a dream that is one step nearer awakening than that nightmare of the former days. She found great comfort and assurance in my altered clothes. She liked the new fashion of dress, she alleged. It was not simply altered clothes. I did grow 2 inches, broaden some inches round my chest, and increase in weight 3 stones before I was 23. I wore a soft brown cloth, and she would caress my sleeve and admire it greatly. She had the woman's sense of texture very strong in her. Sometimes she would muse upon the past, rubbing together her poor rough hands. They never got softened, one over the other. She told me much I had not heard before about my father and her own early life. It was like finding flat and faded flowers in a book, still faintly sweet, to realize that once my mother had been loved with passion, that my remote father had once shed hot tears of tenderness in her arms, and she would sometimes even speak tentatively in those narrow old-world phrases that her lips could rob of all their bitter narrowness, of Nettie. "She wasn't worthy of you, dear," she would say abruptly, leaving me to guess the person she intended. "No man is worthy of a woman's love," I answered. "No woman is worthy of a man's. I love her, dear mother, and that you cannot alter." "There's others," she would muse. "Not for me," I said. "No, I didn't fire a shot that time. I burnt my magazine. I can't begin again, mother, not from the beginning." She sighed and said no more then. At another time she said, I think her words were, "You'll be lonely when I'm gone, dear." "You'll not think of going then," I said. Dear, but man and maid should come together." I said nothing to that. "You brood overmuch on Nettie, dear. If I could see you married to some sweet girl of a woman, some good, kind girl. Dear mother, I'm married enough. Perhaps some day, who knows, I can wait. But to have nothing to do with women. I have my friends. Don't you trouble, mother. There's plentiful work for a man in this world, though the heart of love is cast out from him. Nettie was life and beauty for me, is, will be. Don't think I've lost too much, mother, because in my heart I told myself the end had still to come. And once she sprang a question on me suddenly that surprised me. "Where are they now?" she asked. "Who?" "Nettie and him." She had pierced to the marrow of my thoughts. "I don't know," I said shortly. Her shriveled hand just fluttered into touch of mine. "It's better so," she said, as if pleading. "Indeed, it is better so." There was something in her quivering old voice that for a moment took me back across an epoch to the protests of the former time, to those counsels of submission, those appeals not to offend it, that had always stirred an angry spirit of rebellion within me. "That is the thing I doubt," I said. And abruptly I felt I could talk no more to her of Nettie. I got up and walked away from her, and came back after a while to speak of other things, with a bunch of daffodils for her in my hand. But I did not always spend my afternoons with her. There were days when my crushed hunger for Nettie rose again, and then I had to be alone. I walked or bicycled, and presently I found a new interest and relief in learning to ride, for the horse was already very swiftly reaping the benefit to the change. Hardly anywhere was the inhumanity of horse traction to be found after the first year of the new epoch. Everywhere lugging and dragging and straining was done by machines, and the horse had become a beautiful instrument for the pleasure and carriage of youth. I rode both in the saddle and, what is finer, naked and barebacked. I found violent exercises were good for the states of enormous melancholy that came upon me, and when at last horse riding palled, I went and joined the aviators who practiced soaring upon aeroplanes beyond Horsemarden Hill. But at least every alternate day I spent with my mother, and altogether I think I gave her 2/3 of my afternoons. End of Book 3, Chapter 2, Sections 1 to 3. Book 3, Chapter 2, Section 4 of In the Days of the Comet. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. In the Days of the Comet by H.G. Wells, Book 3, Chapter 2, Section 4. When presently that illness, that fading weakness that made an euthanasia for so many of the older people in the beginning of the new time, took hold upon my mother, there came Anna Reeves to daughter her, after our new custom. She chose to come. She was already known to us, a little from chance meetings and chance services she had done my mother in the garden. She sought to give her help. She seemed then just one of those plainly good girls the world at its worst has never failed to produce, who were indeed in the dark old times the hidden antiseptic of all our hustling, hating, faithless lives. They made their secret voiceless worship, they did their steadfast, uninspired, unthanked, unselfish work as helpful daughters, as nurses, as faithful servants, as the humble providences of homes. She was almost exactly 3 years older than I. At first I found no beauty in her. She was short, but rather sturdy and ruddy, with red-tinged hair and fair, hairy brows and red-brown eyes. But her freckled hands, I found, were full of apt help. Her voice carried good cheer. At first she was no more than a blue-clad, white-aproned benevolence that moved in the shadows behind the bed on which my old mother lay and sank restfully to death. She would come forward to anticipate some little need, to prefer some simple comfort, and always then my mother smiled on her. In a little while I discovered the beauty of that helpful poise of her woman's body, I discovered the grace of untiring goodness, the sweetness of a tender pity, and the great riches of her voice, of her few reassuring words and phrases. I noted and remembered very clearly how once my mother's lean old hand patted the firm gold-flecked strength of hers as it went by upon its duties with the coverlet. "She is a good girl to me," said my mother one day. "A good girl, like a daughter should be." "I never had a daughter, really," she mused peacefully for a space. "Your little sister died," she said. I had never heard of that little sister. "November the 10th," said my mother. 29 months and 3 days. I cried. That was before you came, dear. So long ago, and I can see it now. I was a young wife then, and your father was very kind. But I can see its hands, its dear little quiet hands. Dear, they say that now they will not let the little children die." "No, dear mother," I said. "We shall do better now. The club doctor could not come. Your father went twice. There was someone else, someone who paid. So your father went on into Swathinglea, and that man wouldn't come unless he had his fee. And your father had changed his clothes to look more respectful, and he hadn't any money, not even his tram fare home. It seemed cruel to be waiting there with my baby thing in pain. And I can't help thinking perhaps we might have saved her. But it was like that with the poor always, in the bad old times, always. When the doctor came at last he was angry. 'Why wasn't I called before?' he said, and he took no pains. He was angry because someone hadn't explained. I begged him, but it was too late." She said these things very quietly, with drooping eyelids, like one who describes a dream. "We're going to manage all those things better now," I said, feeling a strange resentment at this pitiful little story her faded, matter-of-fact voice was telling me. "She talked," my mother went on. "She talked for her age wonderfully. Hippopotamus." "Huh?" I said. "Hippopotamus, dear, quite plainly one day when her father was showing her pictures and her little prayers. Now I lay me down to sleep. I made her little socks. Knitted they was, dear, and the heel most difficult." Her eyes were closed now. She spoke no longer to me, but to herself. She whispered other vague things, little sentences, ghosts of long-dead moments. Her words grew less distinct. Presently she was asleep, and I got up and went out of the room. But my mind was queerly obsessed by the thought of that little life that had been glad and hopeful, only to pass so inexplicably out of hope again into nonentity. This sister of whom I had never heard before. And presently I was in a black rage at all the irrecoverable sorrows of the past, of that great ocean of avoidable suffering of which this was but one luminous and quivering red drop. I walked in the garden, and the garden was too small for me. I went out to wander on the moors. "The past is past," I cried, and all the while across the gulf of 25 years I could hear my poor mother's heart-wrung weeping for that daughter baby who had suffered and died. Indeed, that old spirit of rebellion has not altogether died in me, for all the transformation of the new time. I quieted down at last to a thin and austere comfort in thinking that the whole is not told to us, that it cannot perhaps be told to such minds as ours, and anyhow, and what was far more sustaining, that now we have strength and courage and this new gift of wise love. Whatever cruel and sad things marred the past, none of these sorrowful things that made the very warp and woof of the old life need now go on happening. We could foresee, we could prevent and save. The past is past, I said, between sighing and resolve, as I came into view again on my homeward way of the 100 sunset-lit windows of the old Lowchester house. Those sorrows are sorrows no more. But I could not altogether cheat that common sadness of the new time, that memory and insoluble riddle of the countless lives that had stumbled and failed in pain and darkness, before our air grew clear. End of Book 3, Chapter 2, Section 4. Book 3, Chapter 3, Section 1 of In the Days of the Comet. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. In the Days of the Comet by H.G. Wells. Book 3, Chapter 3, Section 1. Beltane and New Year's Eve. In the end, my mother died rather suddenly, and her death came as a shock to me. Diagnosis was still very inadequate at that time. The doctors were, of course, fully alive to the incredible defects of their common training, and were doing all they could to supply its deficiencies, but they were still extraordinarily ignorant. Some unintelligently observed factor of her illness came into play with her, and she became feverish and sank and died very quickly. I do not know what remedial measures were attempted. I hardly knew what was happening until the whole thing was over. At that time my attention was much engaged by the stir of the great Beltane festival that was held on May Day in the year of scaffolding. It was the first of 10 great rubbish burnings that opened the new age. Young people nowadays can scarcely hope to imagine the enormous quantities of pure litter and useless accumulation with which we had to deal. Had we not set aside a special day and season, the whole world would have been an incessant reek of small fires, and it was, I think, a happy idea to revive this ancient festival of the May and November burnings. It was inevitable that the old idea of purification should revive with a name. It was felt to be a burning of other than material encumbrances, innumerable quasi-spiritual things, deeds, documents, debts, vindictive records went up in these great flares. People passed praying between the fires, and it was a fine symbol of the new and wiser tolerance that had come to men, that those who still found their comfort in the orthodox faiths came hither unpersuaded to pray that all hate might be burnt out of their professions. For even in the fires of Baal, now that men have done with base hatred, one may find the living God. Endless were the things we had to destroy in those great purgings. First, there were nearly all the houses and buildings of the old time. In the end, we did not save in England one building in 5,000 that was standing when the comet came. Year by year, as we made our homes afresh, in accordance with the saner needs of our new social families, we swept away more and more of those horrible structures. The ancient residential houses, hastily built, without imagination, without beauty, without common honesty, without even comfort or convenience, in which the early 20th century had sheltered until scarcely one remained. We saved nothing but what was beautiful or interesting out of all their gaunt and melancholy abundance. The actual houses, of course, we could not drag to our fires, but we brought all their ill-fitting deal doors, their dreadful window sashes, their servant-tormenting staircases, their dank, dark cupboards, the verminous papers from their scaly walls, their dust and dirt-sodden carpets, their ill-designed and yet pretentious tables and chairs, sideboards and chests of drawers, the old dirt-saturated books, their ornaments, their dirty, decayed, and altogether painful ornaments, amidst which I remember there were sometimes even stuffed dead birds. We burnt them all. The paint-plastered woodwork, with coat above coat of nasty paint, that in particular blazed finely. I have already tried to give you an impression of old-world furniture, of Parload's bedroom, my mother's room, Mr. Gapita's sitting-room, but thank heaven, there is nothing in life now to convey the particular dinginess of it all. For one thing, there is no more imperfect combustion of coal going on everywhere, and no roadways like grassless open scars along the earth from which dust pours out perpetually. We burnt and destroyed most of our private buildings and all the woodwork, all our furniture, except a few score thousand pieces of distinct and intentional beauty from which our present forms have developed, nearly all our hangings and carpets, and also we destroyed almost every scrap of old-world clothing. Only a few carefully disinfected types and vestiges of that remain now in our museums. One writes now with a particular horror of the dress of the old world. The men's clothes were worn without any cleansing process at all, except an occasional superficial brushing, for periods of a year or so. They were made of dark, obscurely mixed patterns to conceal the stage of defilement they had reached, and they were of a felted and porous texture, admirably calculated to accumulate drifting matter. Many women wore skirts of similar substances, and of so long and inconvenient a form that they inevitably trailed among all the abomination of our horse-frequented roads. It was our boast in England that the whole of our population was booted. Their feet were, for the most part, ugly enough to need it, but it becomes now inconceivable how they could have imprisoned their feet in the amazing cases of leather and imitations of leather they used. I have heard it said that a large part of the physical decline that was apparent in our people during the closing years of the 19th century, though no doubt due in part to the miscellaneous badness of the food they ate, was in the main attributable to the vileness of the common footwear. They shirked open-air exercise altogether because their boots wore out ruinously and pinched and hurt them if they took it. I have mentioned, I think, the part my own boots played in the squalid drama of my adolescence. I had a sense of unholy triumph over a fallen enemy when at last I found myself steering truck after truck of cheap boots and shoes, unsold stock from Swathinglea, to the run-off by the top of the Glansville blast furnaces. Plop! They would drop into the cone when Beltane came, and the roar of their burning would fill the air. Never a cold would come from the saturation of their brown paper soles, never a corn from their foolish shapes, never a nail in them get home at last in suffering flesh. Most of our public buildings we destroyed and burnt as we reshaped our plan of habitation. Our theatre sheds, our banks and inconvenient business warrens, our factories, these in the first year of all, and all the unmeaning repetition of silly little sham Gothic churches and meeting-houses, mean-looking shells of stone and mortar without love, invention, or any beauty at all in them, that men had thrust into the face of their sweated God, even as they thrust cheap food into the mouths of their sweated workers. All these we also swept away in the course of that first decade. Then we had the whole of the superseded steam railway system to scrap and get rid of. Stations, signals, fences, rolling stock, a plant of ill-planned, smoke-distributing nuisance apparatus that would, under former conditions, have maintained an offensive, dwindling, obstructive life for perhaps half a century. Then also there was a great harvest of fences, notice boards, hoardings, ugly sheds, all the corrugated iron in the world, and everything that was smeared with tar, all our gas-works and petroleum stores, all our horse vehicles and vans and lorries had to be erased. But I've said enough now, perhaps, to give some idea of the bulk and quality of our great bonfires, our burnings up, our meltings down, our toil of sheer wreckage over and above the constructive effort in those early years. But these were the coarse material bases of the phoenix fires of the world. These were but the outward and visible signs of the innumerable claims, rights, adhesions, debts, bills, deeds, and charters that were cast upon the fires, a vast accumulation of insignia and uniforms, neither curious enough nor beautiful enough to preserve were to swell the blaze, and all, saving a few truly glorious trophies and memories of our symbols, our apparatus and material of war, then innumerable triumphs of our old, bastard, half-commercial fine art were presently condemned, great oil paintings done to please the half-educated middle class glared for a moment and were gone, Academy marbles crumbled to useful lime, a gross multitude of silly statuettes and decorative crockery, and hangings and embroideries and bad music and musical instruments shared this fate. And books, countless books too, and bales of newspapers went also to these pyres. From the private houses in Swathington alone, which I had deemed, perhaps not unjustly, altogether illiterate, we gathered a whole dust-cart full of cheap, ill-printed editions of the minor English classics, for the most part very dull stuff indeed, and still clean, and about a truckload of thumbed and dog-eared penny fiction, watery-based stuff, the dropsy of our nation's mind. And it seemed to me that when we gathered those books and papers together, we gathered together something more than print and paper. We gathered warped and crippled ideas and contagious base suggestions, the formula of dull tolerances and stupid impatiences, the mean defensive ingenuities of sluggish habits of thinking and timid and indolent evasions. There was more than a touch of malignant satisfaction for me in helping gather it all together. I was so busy, I say, with my share in this dustman's work that I did not notice, as I should otherwise have done, the little indications of change in my mother's state. Indeed, I thought her a little stronger. She was slightly flushed, slightly more talkative. On Beltane Eve, and our Lowchester rummage being finished, I went along the valley to the far end of Swathinglea to help sort the stock of the detached group of pot-banks there. Their chief output had been mantel ornaments in imitation of marble, and there was very little sorting, I found, to be done. And there it was, Nurse Anna found me at last by telephone, and told me my mother had died in the morning, suddenly and very shortly after my departure. For a while I did not seem to believe it. This obviously imminent event stunned me when it came, as though I had never had an anticipatory moment. For a while I went on working, and then almost apathetically, in a mood of half-reluctant curiosity, I started for Lowchester. When I got there, the last offices were over, and I was shown my old mother's peaceful white face, very still, but a little cold and stern to me, a little unfamiliar, lying among white flowers. I went in alone to her into that quiet room, and stood for a long time by her bedside. I sat down then and thought. Then at last, strangely hushed, and with the deeps of my loneliness opening beneath me, I came out of that room and down into the world again, a bright-eyed, active world, very noisy, happy and busy with its last preparations for the mighty cremation of past and superseded things. End of Book 3, Chapter 3, Section 1. Book 3, Chapter 3, Sections 2 and 3 of In the Days of the Comet. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. In the Days of the Comet by H.G. Wells. Book 3, Chapter 3, Sections 2 and 3. I remember that first Beltane festival as the most terribly lonely night in my life. It stands in my mind in fragments, fragments of intense feeling with forgotten gaps between. I recall very distinctly being upon the great staircase of Lowchester House, though I don't remember getting there from the room in which my mother lay, and how upon the landing I met Anna ascending as I came down, She had but just heard of my return, and she was hurrying upstairs to me. She stopped, and so did I, and we stood and clasped hands, and she scrutinized my face in the way women sometimes do. So we remained for a second or so. I could say nothing to her at all, but I could feel the wave of her emotion. I halted, answered the earnest pressure of her hand, relinquished it, and after a queer second of hesitation went on down, returning to my own preoccupations. It did not occur to me at all then to ask myself what she might be thinking or feeling. I remember the corridor full of mellow evening light, and how I went mechanically some paces toward the dining-room. Then, at the sight of the little tables and a gusty outburst of talking voices as someone in front of me swung the door open and to, I remembered that I did not want to eat. After that comes an impression of myself walking across the open grass in front of the house, and the purpose I had of getting alone upon the moors, and how somebody passing me said something about a hat. I had come out without my hat. A fragment of thought has linked itself with an effect of long shadows upon turf golden with the light of the sinking sun. The world was singularly empty, I thought, without either Nettie or my mother. There wasn't any sense in it any more. Nettie was already back in my mind then. Then I am out on the moors. I avoided the crests where the bonfires were being piled, and sought the lonely places. I remember very clearly sitting on a gate beyond the park, in a fold just below the crest that hid Beacon Hill bonfire and its crowd. I was looking at and admiring the sunset. The golden earth and sky seemed like a little bubble that floated in the globe of human futility. Then, in the twilight, I walked along an unknown, bat-haunted road between high hedges. I did not sleep under a roof that night, but I hungered and ate. I ate near midnight at a little inn over toward Birmingham and miles away from my home. Instinctively I had avoided the crests where the bonfire crowds gathered, but here there were many people, and I had to share a table with a man who had some useless mortgage deeds to burn. I talked to him about them, but my soul stood at a great distance behind my lips. Soon each hilltop bore a little tulip-shaped flame flower. Little black figures clustered round and dotted the base of its petals. And as for the rest of the multitude abroad, the kindly night swallowed them up. By leaving the roads and clear paths and wandering in the fields, I contrived to keep alone, though the confused noise of voices and the roaring and crackling of great fires was always near me. I wandered into a lonely meadow, and presently, in a hollow of deep shadows, I lay down to stare at the stars. I lay hidden in the darkness, and ever and again the sough and uproar of the Beltane fires that were burning up the serf follies of a vanished age, and the shouting of the people passing through the fires and praying to be delivered from the prison of themselves, reached my ears. And I thought of my mother, and then of my new loneliness and the hunger of my heart for Nettie. I thought of many things that night, but chiefly of the overflowing personal love and tenderness that had come to me in the wake of the change, of the greater need, the unsatisfied need in which I stood for this one person who could fulfill all my desires. So long as my mother had lived, she had in a measure held my heart, given me a food these emotions could live upon, and mitigated that emptiness of spirit. But now suddenly that one possible comfort had left me. There had been many at the season of the change who had thought that this great enlargement of mankind would abolish personal love, but indeed it had only made it finer, fuller, more vitally necessary. They had thought that, seeing men now were all full of the joyful passion to make and do, and glad and loving and of willing service to all their fellows, there would be no need of the one intimate, trusting communion that had been the finest thing of the former life. And indeed, so far as this was a matter of advantage and the struggle for existence, they were right. But so far as it was a matter of the spirit and the fine perceptions of life, it was altogether wrong. We had indeed not eliminated personal love. We had but stripped it of its base wrappings, of its pride, its suspicions, its mercenary and competitive elements, until at last it stood up in our minds, stark, shining, and invincible. Through all the fine, divaricating ways of the new life, it grew ever more evident. There were for every one certain persons, mysteriously and indescribably in the key of oneself, whose mere presence gave pleasure, whose mere existence was interest, whose idiosyncrasy blended with accident to make a completing and predominant harmony for their predestined lovers. They were the essential thing in life. Without them, the fine brave show of the rejuvenated world was a caparisoned steed without a rider, a bowl without a flower, a theatre without a play. And to me that night of Beltane it was as clear as white flames that Nettie and Nettie alone roused those harmonies in me. And she had gone. I had sent her from me. I knew not whither she had gone. I had in my first virtuous foolishness cut her out of my life forever. So I saw it then, and I lay unseen in the darkness and called upon Nettie and wept for her, lay upon my face and wept for her, while the glad people went to and fro, and the smoke streamed thick across the distant stars, and the red reflections, the shadows, and the fluctuating glares danced over the face of the world. No, the change had freed us from our baser passions indeed, from habitual and mechanical concupiscence, and mean issues, and coarse imaginings. But from the passions of love it had not freed us. It had but brought the Lord of life, Eros, to his own. All through the long sorrow of that night, I, who had rejected him, confessed his sway with tears and inappeasable regrets. I cannot give the remotest guess of when I rose up, nor of my tortuous wanderings in the valleys between the midnight fires, nor how I evaded the laughing and rejoicing multitudes who went streaming home between 3 and 4 to resume their lives, swept and garnished, stripped and clean. But at dawn, when the ashes of the world's gladness were ceasing to glow, it was a bleak dawn that made me shiver in my thin summer clothes. I came across a field to a little copse full of dim blue hyacinths. A queer sense of familiarity arrested my steps, and I stood puzzled. Then I was moved to go a dozen paces from the path, and at once a singularly misshapen tree hitched itself into a notch in my memory. This was the place. Here I had stood. There I had placed my old kite and shot with my revolver, learning to use it against the day when I should encounter Verrall. Kite and revolver had gone now, and all my hot and narrow past. Its last vestiges had shriveled and vanished in the whirling gusts of the Beltane fires. And so I walked through a world of grey ashes at last, back to the great house in which the dead, deserted image of my dear lost mother lay. Section 3. I came back to Lowchester House, very tired, very wretched, exhausted by my fruitless longing for Nettie. I had no thoughts of what lay before me. A miserable attraction drew me into the great house to look again on the stillness that had been my mother's face. And as I came into that room, Anna, who had been sitting by the open window, rose to meet me. She had the air of one who waits. She, too, was pale with watching. All night she had watched between the dead within and the Beltane fires abroad, and longed for my coming. I stood mute between her and the bedside. "Willie," she whispered, and eyes and body seemed incarnate pity. An unseen presence drew us together. My mother's face became resolute, commanding. I turned to Anna as a child may turn to its nurse. I put my hands about her strong shoulders. She folded me to her, and my heart gave way. I buried my face in her breast and clung to her weakly and burst into a passion of weeping. She held me with hungry arms. She whispered to me, "There, there," as one whispers comfort to a child. Suddenly she was kissing me. She kissed me with a hungry intensity of passion, on my cheeks, on my lips. She kissed me on my lips with lips that were salt with tears, and I returned her kisses. Then abruptly we desisted and stood apart, looking at one another. End of Book 3, Chapter 3, Sections 2 and 3. Book 3, Chapter 3, Section 4 of In the Days of the Comet. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. In the Days of the Comet by H.G. Wells. Book 3, Chapter 3, Section 4. It seems to me as if the intense memory of Nettie vanished utterly out of my mind at the touch of Anna's lips. I loved Anna. We went to the council of our group, commune it was then called, and she was given me in marriage. And within a year she had borne me a son. We saw much of one another, and talked ourselves very close together. My faithful friend she became, and has been always, and for a time we were passionate lovers. Always she has loved me, and kept my soul full of tender gratitude and love for her. Always when we met, our hands and eyes clasped in friendly greeting. All through our lives from that hour we have been each other's secure help and refuge, each other's ungrudging fastness of help, and sweetly frank and open speech. And after a little while my love and desire for Nettie returned as though it had never faded away. No one will have a difficulty now in understanding how that could be, but in the evil days of the world malaria that would have been held to be the most impossible thing. I should have had to crush that second love out of my thoughts, to have kept it secret from Anna, to have lied about it to all the world. The old world theory was there was only one love. We who float upon a sea of love find that hard to understand. The whole nature of a man was supposed to go out to the one girl or woman who possessed him, her whole nature to go out to him. Nothing was left over. It was a discreditable thing to have any overplus at all. They formed a secret, secluded system of two, and such children as she bore him. All other women he was held bound to find no beauty in, no sweetness, no interest, and she likewise in no other man. The old-time men and women went apart in couples into defensive little houses, like beasts into little pits, and in these homes they sat down, purposing to love, but really coming very soon to jealous watching of this extravagant mutual proprietorship. All freshness passed very speedily out of their love, out of their conversation, all pride out of their common life. To permit each other freedom was blank dishonor. That I and Anna should love, and after our love journey together go about our separate lives and dine at public tables until the advent of her motherhood, would have seemed a terrible strain upon our unmitigable loyalty. And that I should have it in me to go on loving Nettie, who loved in different manner both Verrall and me, would have outraged the very quintessence of the old convention. In the old days love was a cruel proprietary thing, but now Anna, could let Nettie live in the world of my mind as freely as a rose will suffer the presence of white lilies. If I could hear notes that were not in her compass, she was glad, because she loved me, that I should listen to other music than hers. And she, too, could see the beauty of Nettie. Life is so rich and generous now, giving friendship and 1,000 tender interests and helps and comforts, that no one stints another of the full realization of all possibilities of beauty. For me, from the beginning, Nettie was the figure of beauty, the shape and color of the divine principle that lights the world. For everyone there are certain types, certain faces and forms, gestures, voices, and intonations that have that inexplicable, unanalyzable quality. These come through the crowd of kindly, friendly fellow men and women, one's own. These touch one mysteriously, stir deeps that must otherwise slumber, pierce and interpret the world. To refuse this interpretation is to refuse the sun, to darken and deaden all life. I loved Nettie. I loved all who were like her, in the measure that they were like her, in voice or eyes or form or smile. And between my wife and me there was no bitterness that the great goddess, the life-giver, Aphrodite, queen of the living seas, came to my imagination so. It qualified our mutual love not at all, since now in our changed world love is unstinted. It is a golden net about our globe that nets all humanity together. I thought of Nettie much, and always movingly beautiful things restored me to her. All fine music, all pure deep color, all tender and solemn things. The stars were hers, and the mystery of moonlight, the sun she wore in her hair, powdered finely, beaten into gleams and threads of sunlight in the wisps and strands of her hair. Then suddenly one day a letter came to me from her, in her unaltered, clear handwriting, but in a new language of expression, telling me many things. She had learnt of my mother's death, and the thought of me had grown so strong as to pierce the silence I had imposed on her. We wrote to one another like common friends, with a certain restraint between us at first, and with a great longing to see her once more arising in my heart. For a time I left that hunger unexpressed, and then I was moved to tell it to her. And so on New Year's Day of the year 4, she came to Lowchester and me. How I remember that coming, across the gulf of 50 years. I went out across the park to meet her, so that we should meet alone. The windless morning was clear and cold, the ground new carpeted with snow, and all the trees motionless, lace and glitter of frosty crystals. The rising sun had touched the white with a spirit of gold, and my heart beat and sang within me. I remember now the snowy shoulder of the down, sunlit against the bright blue sky, and presently I saw the woman I loved coming through the white still trees. I had made a goddess of Nettie, and behold, she was a fellow creature. She came, warm-wrapped and tremulous, to me, with the tender promise of tears in her eyes, with her hands outstretched and that dear smile quivering upon her lips. She stepped out of the dream I had made of her, a thing of needs and regrets and human kindliness. Her hands, as I took them, were a little cold. The goddess shone through her indeed, glowed in all her body. She was a worshipful temple of love for me, yes, but I could feel, like a thing new discovered, the texture and sinews of her living, her dear personal and mortal hands. End of Book 3, Chapter 3, Section 4.
This is the Epilogue, The Window of the Tower, Section 35, from In the Days of the Comet. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Steve McDaniel. This was as much as this pleasant-looking gray-haired man had written. I had been lost in his story throughout the earlier portions of it, forgetful of the writer and his gracious room and the high tower in which he was sitting. But gradually, as I drew near the end, the sense of strangeness returned to me. It was more and more evident to me that this was a different humanity from any I had known, unreal, having different customs, different beliefs, different interpretations, different emotions. It was no mere change in conditions and institutions the comet had wrought. It had made a change of heart and mind. In a manner, it had dehumanized the world, robbed it of its spites, its little jealousies, its inconsistencies, its humor. At the end, and particularly after the death of his mother, I felt his story had slipped away from my sympathies altogether. Those Beltane fires had burnt something in him that worked, living still and unsubdued in me, that rebelled in particular at that return of Nettie. I became a little inattentive. I no longer felt with him, nor gathered a sense of complete understanding from his phrases. His Lord Eros indeed. He and these transfigured people, they were beautiful and noble people, like the people one sees in great pictures, like the gods of noble sculpture, but they had no nearer fellowship than these to men. As the change was realized, with every stage of realization, the gulf widened, and it was harder to follow his words. I put down the last fascicle of all and met his friendly eyes. It was hard to dislike him. I felt a subtle embarrassment in putting the question that perplexed me, and yet it seemed so material to me, I had to put it. "And did you," I asked, "were you lovers?" His eyebrows rose. "Of course." But your wife?" It was manifest he did not understand me. I hesitated still more. I was perplexed by a conviction of baseness. "But," I began, "you remained lovers?" "Yes." I had grave doubts if I understood him, or he me. I made a still more courageous attempt. "And had Nettie no other lovers?" "A beautiful woman like that, I know not how many loved beauty in her, nor what she found in others. But we four from that time were very close, you understand. We were friends, helpers, personal lovers in a world of lovers." "Four?" "That was Verral." Then suddenly it came to me that the thoughts that stirred in my mind were sinister and base, that the queer suspicions, the coarseness and coarse jealousies of my old world were over and done for these more finely living souls. "You made," I said, trying to be liberal-minded, "a home together." "A home." He looked at me, and I know not why. I glanced down at my feet. What a clumsy, ill-made thing a boot is, and how hard and colorless seemed my clothing. How harshly I stood out amidst these fine, perfected things. I had a moment of rebellious detestation. I wanted to get out of all this. After all, it wasn't my style. I wanted intensely to say something that would bring him down a peg, make sure, as it were, of my suspicions by launching an offensive accusation. I looked up, and he was standing. "I forgot," he said. "You are pretending the old world is still going on. A home." He put out his hand, and quite noiselessly the great window widened down to us, and the splendid nearer prospect of that dreamland city was before me. There, for one clear moment, I saw it, its galleries and open spaces, its trees of golden fruit and crystal waters, its music and rejoicing, love and beauty without ceasing flowing through its varied and intricate streets. And the nearer people I saw now, directly and plainly, and no longer in the distorted mirror that hung overhead. They really did not justify my suspicions, and yet they were such people as one sees on earth, save that they were changed. How can I express that change? As a woman is changed in the eyes of her lover, as a woman is changed by the love of her lover. They were exalted. I stood up beside him and looked out. I was a little flushed, my ears a little reddened by the inconvenience of my curiosities, and by my uneasy sense of profound moral differences. He was taller than I. "This is our home," he said, smiling, and with thoughtful eyes on me. End of Epilogue, Section 35, and end of In the Days of the Comet by H.G. Wells. Recording by Steve McDaniel.